thank you so much, everybody, for the time that you've made to come together for our fourth provocation in the series. It's been so wonderful being joined by wonderful guests, and today is no different. We have a really topical topic, the end of unit level assessment ? And so we're really excited that you could all join us for this provocation. I might hand over to Anne for a brief introduction, and then we'll leave you in Liesbeth's hands.
So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the beautiful country. We are situated on Dharawal country, but we recognise that the University of Wollongong covers many Aboriginal communities as well as our offshore campuses. And Robin's coming to you from Dharawal. So if you want to mention where you come from, we are more than happy for you to have that added to the chat. Our weather today, our beautiful country is having a drink. It's very, very thirsty because we've been blessed with some lovely weather, but very, very dry. So fortunately, our country is being replenished by the rain and getting some relief with a little bit of cool weather as well. We acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on our beautiful country and on our campus footprint, and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. So this is provocation number 4, 2 a week, and we're rolling through them. So this is provocation number 4, the end of unit level assessment. And we encourage you to register for the other provocations to come. And if you haven't caught up on any of the provocations to date, as I said, the recordings are available on the booking site and replacing the booking links. The link is there for registration purposes.
Great. So
I'll hand back to Elise.
And this is the part where we get the privilege of introducing our provocateur. And today we are really pleased to be joined by the wonderful Professor Liesbeth Baartman, who is a leading international expert on programmatic assessment and competency-based education, based at the University of Applied Sciences in Utrect. And her research offers deep insight into how assessment systems can support learning across entire programs, particularly in digital complex environments. So thank you so much for joining us, Liesbeth, especially given how early it is in the morning from the world in which you are. So I might leave us in your very capable hands.
Thank you so much, Elise, and thank you, Elise and Anne, for the invitation to lead this provocation session. I'm really looking forward to it. So thanks for the introduction. I will be talking to you about the end of unit level assessment, and I would like to mention that I'm not only from Utrecht University, but also from Maastricht University, the School of Health Professions Education. I put both on the slides over here. I work at 2 universities. Okay, yeah, this works. So just a tiny little bit about the Netherlands, where I come from. This is the Netherlands. Where I live is Utrecht, right in the center here. So Utrecht University is over there, and Maastricht University is south below there. But just to give you an impression of the size of the Netherlands, it takes me 2 hours to travel from Utrecht to Maastricht. So that's about the size of the entire country. And I visited Melbourne last year. I visited Deakin University and the Cradle Research Group, where I met these wonderful people from Australia. And we set up many collaborations. So now I know that you're in Australia, distances are so completely different. So this is where I come from. And maybe good to know and understand my story is that in the Netherlands we have research-focused universities like Maastricht, and we have universities of applied sciences, which are much more profession-focused, and that's Utrecht is one of the examples. And I understood in Australia you have more or less the same distinction, though it's a bit more prominent in the Netherlands, probably. With regard to higher education, it's good to know that our higher education educators or our academic staff, they usually have, in the universities of applied sciences, they usually have a background in their original profession. So they were a physiotherapist or a journalist, and they entered higher education later on in their career. In the research-focused universities, academic staff usually have a background in research, and they need a basic teaching qualification, including a focus on assessment literacy, to work in higher education. And that's where we also work on, for example, assessment, unit level assessment, program level assessment, etc. And the last thing is that I lead a community of practice on programmatic assessment in the Netherlands, also a little bit more internationally at the moment. And yearly, about 40 courses, programs participate in this community of practice, and they all design programmatic assessment or already work with programmatic assessment. So some of the examples I will provide come from this community of practice. And that's where I work with many, many courses who do this. That's about the background, I think. As you know, I'm not a native speaker, so please, if you don't understand anything I say, I know, for example, that it's sometimes talking about units or courses or programs. I will use the word unit when I mean a shorter part of a course, and I will use the word course for the entire program, so the entire master's or bachelor course, for example. And I understood that's the terminology you use, but I know it's different throughout the world. So today, I will talk about the end of unit level assessment, and I focused my presentation on programmatic assessment and some of its essentials and why it's fundamentally different. So that's the provocation part. So to start with, the complexity of professional practice. Hey, that's strange. I just want to go back one slide. Oh, I made some really interesting connections to your Renaissance program. Somehow the slide disappeared. No, well, I just say then that I loved your Renaissance program, and I had a look at it, and I love the idea even of the pixels that you have in the presentations. You might recognize the pixels in my presentation as well. And I like the idea of the course-wide mapping. I will talk about that. And about AI professional practice. That's what this is. This is the same idea. So I think what I will present connects really well. There's the slide. Thank you, Elise. I have no idea why it disappeared. But well, okay. So starting with this idea about the complexity of professional practice and the influence of Gen AI, professional practice, the future of our students is unpredictable. Protocols are not sufficient. We want people to be able to think for themselves, to make professional judgments, to make decisions in practice. And those decisions, those judgments are always personal, are subjective, are influenced by someone's personal norms and values and beliefs. And so what would we like professionals to do when they get stuck, for example? And what's the role of Gen AI in professional practice in different disciplines and professional domains? So I would say when people encounter a problem in professional practice, we would like them to, for example, go to a colleague, seek new collaborations, be creative, reach out to stakeholders to discuss what they need and what has changed, and maybe their needs or the solutions have changed accordingly. That's what we would like to do, people to do in practice. But then, on the other hand, when we look at assessment as we know it in higher education, that's so much different. Because assessment, we think of good assessment, it should be objective. It should be comparable. So students and staff get frustrated when one student gets to do something different from another student, and students might regard it as unfair. So it should be standardized. And we tend to work out detailed criteria to assess student work. And I think that doesn't really fit with the needs of professional practice, with this complexity with Gen AI. If you want students to use Gen AI responsibly, I think this is not what works in assessment. This is not what we need to capture professional practice in a valid and reliable way and to help students develop their competencies. So I think there's a discrepancy here, and that's why we need to look at assessment from a new and fresh perspective. And I know that David Bout has led one of the provocative sessions in your series, and I stole this picture from his presentation because it brings me to the topic of this unit level assessment and the topic of the end of unit level assessment, because he already mentioned some of the problems or dangers that we see in higher education. For example, that all the action resides within units, modules, or subjects, and that we do exercises like curriculum mapping, which shows that the units overly focus on some of our learning outcomes or competencies and not on others, that we tend to focus on things that are more easily measurable, for example. And I know that in Australia, the course level or the program level approach has been mentioned as a potential solution or a solution to mitigate the problems of or the dangers even of Gen AI. I don't think I really agree with that, and I don't think that a program level approach can solve all problems, but it does provide a new and fresh perspective on assessment that might help us to not mitigate the dangers of Gen AI, but to validly and reliably capture how I think professionals should work responsibly with Gen AI and how we can help students develop Gen AI capabilities. So I think we can distinguish 3 levels, so to say. So the first are single assessment instruments that reside within those units. The second one is multiple assessments in a program, and the third is programmatic assessment. And you see here that there's a difference. So the multiple assessments in a program means that you look beyond the units or the silos. And for example, the idea of assessment or curriculum mapping is what you can do here. So I made this Excel example, just imaginary example. That's what we often do. So you have the different units, you have the different assessment forms, and you connect them to the program level learning outcomes. So you get to see in this example, for example, that learning outcome X is measured by a multiple choice test, a paper, and an open book exam. So what you see here is you get at least an overview of all assessments within a course. And sometimes, like in this example, you can also see how those assessments connect to the different learning outcomes. And you can see that some learning outcomes aren't as often assessed as others, or that, for example, learning outcome Y is assessed only by workplace feedback. And you could ask whether that's valid and reliable. So that's the advantage of curriculum or assessment mapping. But then when we turn to programmatic assessment, that's something different. It's more, so programmatic assessment is more than just looking at all your assessments in your course or your program. So this is the definition we often use, and I will come back to the aspects of this definition throughout the session. So programmatic assessment is an arrangement of assessment methods that is deliberately designed across the entire curriculum. It is based on an overarching structure of program level learning outcomes, and it's combined and planned to optimize both robust decisions, that's the summative part, the assessment of learning, and it's optimally designed to stimulate student learning, so the assessment for learning part. So then, why is programmatic assessment so fundamentally different? I selected 4 topics that I think 4 elements that make programmatic assessment so fundamentally different. And we will go through each of them. The first is students do not have to pass single assessments. The content and form of single assessment is not determined per unit. We use richness, saturation, and triangulation instead of objectivity and standardization to look at the quality of assessment. And students are seen as active agents in assessment and probably also in decision making. Question mark. So I will build on literature and programmatic assessment. These are some examples of our own work, but especially in medical education. So for example, in Maastricht University, where I work, there's a large body of research on programmatic assessment in medical education and in health professions education. And this is a picture I often use to explain programmatic assessment. I will do so very shortly as we will dive into it in the next parts of the session. But this is kind of the journey that a student makes throughout a course. So what you see here is that students work towards the learning outcomes in the end. And those are the program level learning outcomes. So they are central. So not the unit level, but the program level learning outcomes. What students do, you see this pathway, their learning pathway. Throughout this pathway, students collect a mix of what we call data points. They collect information about their development by means of several different assessment methods. And they collect them in usually a portfolio, a wheelbarrow in this picture. And throughout this journey, there's a rich dialogue about those data points, about this information on student development. That's the assessment for learning part. And what happens at the end is professional judgment based on all data points in the portfolio. So judgments or decisions, I should say, summative decisions, pass-fail decisions, are made based on this entire set of data points. So that's in a nutshell what programmatic assessment is. And now we will dive deeper into why it's so fundamentally different, and I will explain more about it. If you already have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them already. I think no questions at the moment yet, so I think I'll just take a sip of coffee. All right then, the first is students in programmatic assessment. Students do not have to pass single or individual assessments. So one assessment method, I mean here. And why is this such a big change? Because we are used to unit level assessment, in which you, as an educator, as an academic staff member, determine what the assessment looks like in your unit. And this means that students do not have to pass your assessment. So in my experience, that can cause a lot of confusion and even feelings like, oh, apparently students can graduate without passing my assessment. Will they then know enough? Will they then be able to do enough if they do not have to pass my assessment? I didn't design it for nothing. It's important. So why can students fail my assessment? So this is a first, and I would like to explain why that is. So why programmatic assessment started from this idea. And this is already quite an old publication, 2005, and it's one of the starting points of programmatic assessment by that time from Maastricht University. And it shows why single assessments are not reliable. What you see in this table is the testing time in hours, and you see different assessment forms, from multiple choice test on the left-hand side, so very standardized tests, to incognito simulated patients. And it's not necessary to understand all the different assessment methods, but the point is that they get more authentic when you go to the right of this table. So they, for example, workplace-based assessment, incognito patients is in the workplace. So what you see in this table and in this research is first that you need a lot of testing time to make any assessment reliable. Those are reliability coefficients, and they should be like 0.8 for summative purposes. So not a multiple choice, a very short multiple choice test is not reliable. A large one is. You wouldn't want students to take an 8-hour multiple choice test, but the idea is that you need more questions, more testing time actually. So in a multiple choice test, you would need more questions. In the workplace, you would need more observations to make an assessment reliable. So that's one conclusion. And the other one is that any assessment form can be reliable as long as you have enough observations. And that is because competence is very context specific. So if you have an assessment in one context or on one particular subject assignment, it's not likely to be very predictable for the next assessment because performance is so context specific. And that's one of the starting points for programmatic assessment, why we say all of these individual assessments in itself are not reliable. The second reason is validity. Single assessments are no valid measures of those course level, program level learning outcomes. No, as we say, no assessment can do it all. So you need many different assessment forms to be able to validly assess student competence or program level learning outcomes we're talking about here. So each assessment only captures a part of the learning outcomes, depending on the method. So a knowledge test is very suitable for measuring multiple choice questions, for measuring factual knowledge, but you will need other assessment methods. Workplace learning is very suitable for assessing competence in practice, but it's less efficient for measuring knowledge. And what we often see when I talk with academic staff is that they say students can do well on all single assessments, but on the whole might be something different. It leads to academic staff asking questions like, how did this student end up here at the end of our course? And I can only give him or her a pass because we just have to graduate this person. We can't say anymore at this stage, like, you're not going to graduate, but I don't know how he or she ended up here. And that's because students can pass the different assessments throughout the course, but still not be really competent. But we just don't know. And the last reason why we started programmatic assessment is learning. And I think David Bout already told something about how assessment can negatively and often negatively impacts learning. And I'm talking here about course level learning outcomes again, and students usually do not focus on those learning outcomes. At least let me speak for Dutch universities. The learning outcomes are often in one of the guides. We need to write these course guides, unit guides, and you have to, for example, mention which program level learning outcomes are part of your unit. But that's typically something that's written down in one of those guides, but no one ever reads them. Students do not read them. Staff do not really use them. And students are focused on short-term grade acquisition. They want to pass those units. And we can't blame them because that's the system that we put them into. So students do not use the feedback. When they get feedback at the end of a unit, they will look at whether they passed or failed. And when they passed, no student will use the feedback. Why? But we can't blame them. Why would they? They already passed and they will move on to the next unit, which will probably focus on another subject or another topic. So they can't even use the feedback. As we say, it has no landing space. Students simply cannot use it. So the uptake and use of feedback across units or assessment is very difficult for students because of the design of assessment. And the last one is that short-term test preparation without repetition leads to forgetting. That's something we already know for decades. That students will learn for an assessment, they will learn for a test a few days before, they will have forgotten most of it, like 80%, that they will have forgotten it next week. So actually, from that perspective, it's kind of nonsense that you can say as an academic staff member, I want students to pass my assessment. Because if it's an assessment at the end of the unit, students will learn for the test and then have forgotten next week. So it's not true that you can say, oh, when they pass my test, they will know it forever. You need repetition. So you need to organize learning on the longer term. Students need to repeat the knowledge and the skills. So that's how assessment can negatively impact learning, but also what we know about how we can stimulate learning and the use of feedback on the longer term, so longitudinally. And that's what programmatic assessment tries to do. And that's why we focus on the program level. So how does programmatic assessment work? That's this picture. I already mentioned the word data points. So students do not have to fail or do not have to pass single assessments because we view them as pixels or data points. They are just a tiny bit of information about student development. So like in this picture, one of those pixels will not show you the entire picture of student competence or competence development. You need more of those pictures. So that's why we say in programmatic assessment that one data point, so one picture, a pixel, that's one assessment method, is only used for feedback purposes, so not for making pass-fail decisions. And when you collect more of those data points along the way, the picture will get a bit clearer, like in this middle picture. And that's when you focus on intermediate, then you have, we call it intermediate evaluation sessions. You can sit with the student, look at the data points collected so far, and you will see certain patterns. For example, a student gets feedback multiple times from multiple stakeholders, and they will learn like, oh, I got this feedback multiple times already. I have to do something with it. And then you focus on diagnosis and setting new learning goals. And then the high stakes decisions, so the pass-fail decisions, when, for example, credit points are awarded, when students can move on to a next year, when they graduate. Those are high stakes pass-fail decisions. And in programmatic assessment, you make those decisions sometimes after each year and sometimes after half a year, for example. You need enough time to collect those data points before you make a decision. And so pass-fail decisions are being made on multiple data points together. And I see a question, and that's perfect timing, as I already wanted to pause to. So please go ahead, Alice. I don't know how you want to do this.
Okay, yes. Monsi, we're just going to unmute you now. We had the microphones turned off this time so that we could turn them on for questions. So bear with us as we just find you to unmute you.
Oh, there we go. I think I just had to, you unmuted me, then I had to unmute myself too.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I have to admit, I've been struggling with this concept of programmatic assessment more generally. So, for example, in Australia, it's customary, it's sort of standardised that most universities will have 8 units, I think you call them. We call them subjects, but yeah, 8 subjects or units a year. And so instead of having sort of one high stakes decision made at the end of the year, there are effectively 8 smaller high stakes decisions that are made, 4 in the beginning of the first half of the year and 4 in the second half of the year. So the bit I struggle with for programmatic assessment, it's all well, I tend to agree with parts of what you've said in regards to the learning journey throughout that year. But what I struggle with is what happens to the student when they fail. So when the high stakes decision says that this student has not acquired sufficient evidence to pass that year, do they then repeat the entire year, even though some aspects of it they did well? And so this is where breaking it down into units might make it better for students who maybe pass 7 and fail 1. So they only have to repeat 1 unit. So yeah, I struggle with that aspect of programmatic assessment.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question. I will also come back to the decision making later on, but this is how this works in programmatic assessment. Is the idea with the portfolio is that students collect evidence throughout the way. And for example, when you make a high stakes decision at the end of a year and a student fails, we actually do not say he or she fails, but he or she hasn't collected enough information yet. So a lot of evidence will be there already. And I think what you see in practice is a few situations. One would be that a student could remediate, we call it, that it would be feasible to collect 1 or 2 more data points, and they will be very specifically focused on what is missing. So that's scenario 1, and students then move on to the next year, but they get these extra assignments, or sometimes they do that during, in our case, the summer period, and they can move on. The other situation, most programs know where their students will struggle or where students need more support. So they already have a remediation in place because they know that's where many students will fail on. And they could, for example, move on to the next year, but also do this remediation exercises. But that's all with the expectation that the student will be able to move on to the next year and progress. And then you've got the situation in which in the portfolio, you see that a student is lagging behind on many of the competencies or many of the learning outcomes. And you would have to conclude that it's not feasible to move on to the next year because so much is missing. And only in those cases, we would advise the students to repeat the entire year in this case. But that doesn't happen very often. And then it's very reasonable to do that.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Apologies, I know Robin's got her hand up as well. So where I find this most challenging is in the mathematical sciences, where we have a Calculus 101 subject in the first half of the year and a Calculus 102. And I guess the thinking from the academics perspective is that we're setting the student up to fail if we allow them to move on without really achieving a sufficient level in the prior mathematics subject or year level or whatever.
Yeah, I find it a bit difficult because I think when you do really programmatic assessment, you wouldn't do the units or the subjects anymore. They would be structured differently throughout the year. And I'm not an expert on your course, of course, so this is difficult to say, but I can imagine that when students find this subject so difficult, that you would organize it differently throughout the first year and make sure it longitudinally comes back throughout the year. But then again, the same situation could occur if you say that it's not a good idea for this student to move on because he or she first needs to master this and this. And then you would still have the situation that you say you first need to do a remediation because we know that you will fail in the future when we allow you to move on. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And Robin, you're free to unmute now.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I've been really excited by this concept for a very long period of time. So I'm really pleased to be able to hear how it's been implemented. I guess my question follows on from the previous question. And it's not so much from an academic perspective, but it's more from a mother of a child who's currently in undergraduate. And it's understanding that, you know, sometimes you do fail units, or sometimes you do the first year of a certain course and then decide you want to change, or for some reason you didn't miss that one, and or you're doing a reduced academic load. I can see that it would work incredibly well with the stock standard student who starts in year one and then goes right the way through to the end of year 3 or year 4, and then they meet those program objectives. But when you're straddling sort of a first year subject and a third year subject and that type of stuff, does that work in the similar way that you were talking? Is it individual student mapping that we go down to? That's my first question. And my sneaky second one is, how do you shift the thinking of the student away from the secondary schooling HSC, which we have, which is tick this, pass, and then you get a number to be able to move on? That's probably my double barrel question. So if you could answer that in 2 seconds, that'd be fabulous. Thank you.
Wow, that's a big
No
challenge.
pressure. No pressure. Not at all.
2 questions within 2 minutes, which are larger. I mean, I will try to be short. As we'll come back to those issues later on. It's with regard to the flexibility, it's a matter of design. You can design programmatic assessment like very strictly regulated. So you oblige students to collect these and these and these and these data points. But I know examples in which this is much more flexible. So you give students choice to decide on which data points they want to collect with regard to assessment forms, but also with regard to timing, for example. And then you get this flexible curriculum. And the thing is that during COVID, for example, the courses who did programmatic assessment did not encounter as many problems as the other courses, as they could be really flexible. It was not possible to collect data points in the workplace, in healthcare, for example, but students could do different things because it wasn't like set in stone like this and this and this is what you have to do. So yes, it can be much more flexible, but depending on the design. And the one with the students, and how do you get students to get used to this new system? I would say, how do you get the academic staff to get used to this system, which is much more difficult? Yes, you have to introduce it to students. Some courses do like detox weeks at the start of the course. But in my experience, it's more difficult for the academic staff members than for the students. Short answer.
Thank you.
That's
fabulous.
Maybe it's a good idea to move on to the next one. And please, I love these questions, so write them down in the chat or for yourself and ask them later on. To the next one. So the next fundamentally different thing in programmatic assessment is that the content and the form of a single assessment is not determined per unit, so it's not determined by an academic staff member, him or herself, and that's why it's so fundamentally different for academic staff, because actually they cannot determine themselves what their assessment will look like. And why do we do this? This has to do with aggregation of information, and I will explain to you how this works in conventional assessment as we know it in higher education, and that's this situation. So you have unit 1 with an assessment 1 or maybe 2, 3 assessments connected to this unit. And as I said before, in course guides, for example, you might have to mention that unit 1 is connected, in this example, to learning outcome A, B, and D. But assessment is not organized according to learning outcomes, because when a student does an assessment, And in this case, we aggregate information horizontally. So a student will get a grade or a mark or a pass or a fail on that unit. And the fact that learning outcomes A, B, and C were included in the assessment becomes completely invisible. We just don't know how a student performed on those learning outcomes because you just get the pass or the fail on the unit. So that happens for the different units in your course, and you just don't know how a student performed on the different learning outcomes. So in this situation, you might have a student who scores well below level on learning outcome D, for example. But because you take the average every time in each unit, you just don't see it. And a student goes on and goes on and goes on and moves on in the curriculum, but you just don't know, you can't see in the assessment that he or she is lagging behind on one of the learning outcomes. And that's why we lose a lot of very valuable information by the way we assess per unit. And that's why students progress without us knowing that they might need more support on one of the learning outcomes. And that's why in programmatic assessment, it works the other way around. So we aggregate information vertically because you want to know how students are developing on the learning outcomes. So then you get the different data points and we aggregate information based on the different data points. So in this case, learning outcome A, you know something about learning outcome A by means of data points 1 and 3. And learning outcome B, you find information on student development in data points 1, 2, and 4. And that's how you aggregate the information. That's how you map student development and know how students are progressing on the different learning outcomes. And then decision making, so the summative decision is also done based on the learning outcomes and not based on the units. So that's a really fundamental difference, as it means that data points should be always linked to the backbone. And with that, I mean the program level learning outcomes. You need a mix of different forms of assessment to be able to know about student development on the learning outcomes. And you need to schedule them sequentially. And that's the learning part. A good programmatic assessment design deliberately designs those data points in a way that it helps students develop on the learning outcomes. And they can use feedback, like in the example I gave before, that students cannot use feedback in the next assignment. When you design it sequentially, they should be able to use the feedback in the next assignment as it like follows on logically. And the flexibility, yes, that's the question that we just discussed. You can determine the learning outcomes beforehand and say students have to do this and this and this and this, the data points, I mean. But many programs offer at least some amount of freedom for students to choose their own data points. And that's even a really, really good idea because you need some flexibility. For example, when you discover throughout the pathway that the student is lagging behind on learning outcome C, like in this picture before, you need some flexibility for the student to be able to practice more on that specific learning outcome. So it's good to have some flexibility for students to choose a next assignment to practice that specific learning outcome on which they need more practice. But what does it mean for academic staff? That inevitably means that you cannot let academic staff members determine their own assessments per unit, because then you will never get this sequence, this order, this logical order of assessment. You will never know whether the data points nicely map on the learning outcomes, for example. Academic staff need to work together. They need to know what came before, what comes next, to be able to help students to progress on the learning outcomes. So that's one of the real challenges. And I think that's the second one. Any remarks, questions with regard to this?
Can see that, Joe, your hand's up. You're able to unmute now.
Hello, thank you. As you were talking, I was wondering whether something like a 1-year honours program that is an end-on after third year might be a good sort of opportunity to roll something like that out, because it is standalone and students getting to that point would already have their, you know, some of the sort of building blocks, and or even something that is more standalone like micro-credential as a way to trial it. Our honours is already a little bit like that, but actually remove the assessment points. So it is not so hard, I think, for staff and students to digest. It is probably going to be a transition for students. And as previous, I think Robin or Monty's already said that the transition point is where the energy is always lost, because if they're used to like that at high school, they really want to be marked to get that in first year. So if, yeah, just whether your view on that, because it sounds like the context where you're coming from is already, the students already have some form of training before coming into these courses without the assessment.
I would say that in high school in the Netherlands, it sounds the same as your system. Students get a lot of grades. My children are in high school and they only talk about their grades. It's sometimes difficult not to do anything or to discuss with them. But I agree with you that it could be a good idea to, for example, try to implement programmatic assessment in a part of a course in which it fits more easily. Yeah. And that's what I have seen, that for example, they do it in the last year, or even one course implemented programmatic assessment in the third year as a kind of pilot, as an experiment, as they knew that the academic staff, the team was ready for it in that third year, and they were really looking for different ways to assess their students. So they were eager to change. So they started with the third year team, and then when this worked after a year or two, then the other team, so in that case they were organized per year. Then like the second year team said, oh, this is, hey, we see how it works now with you, and this is what we want to do as well. Or they so I think that's a good idea. And you can also do it in like the learning lines. We sometimes have these learning lines that could focus on could be something like academic writing.
Because it seems like the biggest hurdle is the change of mindset for both staff and students, isn't it? If it's kind of a bit more contained and we can actually have confidence that it's going to work, that we can show it work, we have to overcome quite a lot. Thank you.
Yes, it's definitely one of the difficulties is when academic staff really identify with their own subjects. And it's even like, it feels like something personal, and therefore it's threatening when you cannot design your own assessment anymore and have to collaborate with others, and the students might have to fail your assessment, etc. That can be quite threatening.
We do have another hand up, but I might just quickly jump into the Q&A because there was a question that came through there earlier from Tony Zhang in relation to if you could recommend any particular studies or where people might go to learn more perhaps about the evidence base, comparing programmatic approaches like these to different types of perhaps traditional approaches of assessment in regards to learning outcomes.
Would it be a good idea if I share, for example, some references with you afterwards? I could make this list that could be valuable to read for people.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I know there are some in your presentation too. So what I might do is we'll share that within the environment that we disseminate the recordings. And of course, if anyone else would like to share any references as well in the chat and so forth, please do feel free to do that. And I can see Olivia's got her hand up too, so I might pass to you, Olivia, to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I just had a question about how the learning outcomes are assessed. It seems that the learning objectives are kind of, I guess, quite separate in their assessment, and if one is flagged as needing more assistance, then like a alternate action is taken to kind of assess that specific learning objective that might need to be reassessed. I'm just thinking about more theoretical subjects where the assessments kind of have more interconnection with the learning objectives. So I guess my question is, how does the programmatic model of assessment capture the interconnection between learning objectives, not as something as like this specific technical skill needs to be is good and this one isn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
And quickly, can I just jump in? Apologies, I meant to introduce Olivia too as one of our wonderful students as partners who's working with us on the Assessment Reimagined initiative. Her and two other students are joining us in these provocations, and so really grateful for your perspectives and questions from a student perspective there, Olivia. So thank you.
Thanks. That's really great. You're involved, really, and it's a good question. And I think that when I move back to this slide, that I think learning outcomes are always interconnected. At least in professional practice, they will all have their place generally in the tasks, the work that people do. So that's why the data points are usually capture more than one learning outcome. So yes, they are interconnected. And I also understood your question as maybe, for example, with regard to knowledge or knowledge development. That's a question I often get, that a data point could be a knowledge test. There's nothing wrong with a good knowledge test. It's just part of the entire assessment program. And knowledge will also come back in other data points. So that's why, for example, when in one of our programs, when a student does a knowledge test, and for example, the outcome would be like 60%, you score 60%, then we encourage the students to look more deeply into the knowledge test, like which domains or which aspects of this domain do you need to practice more, and does that aspect come back in the other data points? So it's not about passing a knowledge test, but you can demonstrate your knowledge development in various ways. So we encourage students to also look at their assessments or their data points from the learning outcome perspective. And that's a big change. And it usually takes a couple of months for students to get used to that. They first focus on the assignments and on the data point. Oh, this is the task I have to do now. This is my next assignment. And it takes a while before they can make this turn towards a focus on the learning outcomes, in which the data points are just ways of demonstrating your development on the learning outcomes and not things that you have to pass.
Thank you.
And we have Motzi again.
Oh, actually, Elise, if you don't mind, I'd like to know the answer to Christine's question in the chat first before I go.
Thank you. Does programmatic assessment result in a numerical grade at the end of the course, or simply pass or fail?
It does not generally result in a numerical grade, but also for the reasons I think that Dave mentioned, this reason that as human assessors, we cannot distinguish between too many different levels. So in the Netherlands, we have a system of grades from 1 to 10. That's what they use in high school, in which a 5.5 would mean a pass. But in programmatic assessment, it could be simply pass, fail, and sometimes you have distinction or 3 levels, but generally not more than 3 different levels.
Thank you. And there was a question in the Q&A as well from Rosalind Rosario. in a programmatic model where every data point is linked, how do we encourage students to take risks or fail early in the unit without fearing that those early struggles will negatively aggregate into their final summative decision?
Yes, that's a very good question. And it's actually one of the fundamental starting points of programmatic assessment, that learning involves failure, learning involves taking chances, trying, experimenting, etc. And that's one of the reasons why students do not have to pass the data points. So the system allows them to make mistakes. And you take the summative stinger out of every individual assessment. And it not only on the student side, but also on the academic staff side, it means that you can be more critical. You can give more critical feedback to students, as it does not have immediate consequences. When you have this system, the thing is, you need enough data points, so enough opportunities to improve and to show your improvement. And that's where sometimes this is a difficult thing. I have to be honest with that. Because in programmatic assessment systems, students often still experience the data points to be summative and to be things that they have to pass. That is difficult and a real culture shift. When you do not have enough data points, it's logical, I think, because then a data point indeed has too many consequences. You do not have opportunities to practice and to demonstrate again that you improved, that you've become better. But on the other hand, too many data points will mean an enormous workload for academic staff, and students will not have the opportunity to use feedback anymore, as they will just run to gather enough data points. So this is a tricky thing, like the number of data points you need and to really stimulate this learning culture. In my experience, when students do their first data points and they get critical feedback, that's one of the moments in which they realized, and they say to me oh, so this really doesn't have any consequences. You were quite critical on my work, but that I can move on and I can use your feedback to get better. So I didn't get a fail on this assignment. It's this realization, this really works differently here. And they need this a number of times before they can really realize, oh, this is a really different system I'm in now.
And Monsi?
Actually, that follows quite nicely into the question I was going to ask. I mean, if there's a series of data points, and if we wish to be clear and upfront to our students about what is required to pass at the end of the year for that final academic judgment that says, yes, you've passed, you've met sufficient evidence for each of your learning outcomes, there still has to be, we have to provide some guidance about what the expectation of attainment is at each data point. And ultimately, I mean, I don't know, let's just say you don't have to pass every single one, but maybe you need to get at least 50% in 50% of them, or whatever. That doesn't matter what there's got to be some threshold somewhere. We can't just have a black box for the academic decision at the end of the year. If a student, either by choice or by a lack of preparation, for want of a better word, doesn't acquire the necessary evidence in, say, the first 2 out of 4 or first 3 out of 6 data points, at some point, a data point does become summative. It does become a hurdle assessment. Yeah. And how does the student know this? And are we just delaying the inevitable by allowing the student to continuously fail up until that point? I don't know. That's my question.
Yes. And I think so. You have this learning pathway, and yes, you start with the individual data points, focus on learning, etc. And I agree with you that at the end you make a high stakes decision. So kind of the stakes, they increase a little bit throughout this learning period. And in this portfolio, shall I move on already to? If it's okay with you, I move on to the next, as otherwise I will be introducing the story already, but help me if I don't answer your question already, remind me. So this, because this question really had to do with the decision-making part of programmatic assessment, which is the next like difference, the fundamental difference, how this happens in programmatic assessment. So decision-making is based on richness, saturation, and triangulation of information instead of objectivity and standardization. So again, this is fundamentally different for academic staff and students, as we are used to those single assessments that are standardized. We regard fairness as an assessment being the same for everybody. So this is really, these connect to really deeply rooted beliefs that people hold about assessment, about what means for assessment to be good or to be fair or to be reliable. And that's fundamentally different in programmatic assessment. So why is this? First, I need to remark again that we're talking here about program level learning outcomes. And this is fundamentally different for tasks with single correct answers, because then you have one correct answer and you can have a standardized test. No one will disagree about what the correct answer is, and there is no interpretation involved. That's a very important aspect. Whereas when you have learning outcomes that are meant to represent professional practice and the complexity that we started with, assessment will always involve some kind of interpretation, human judgment. And we know from research that judgments of complex tasks are inherently subjective. People aren't objective, and they use adaptive frames of reference. So, for example, they use their own experience. They compare students to students they've seen before. This study was done in workplace assessments. They will use their own ideas of what good work looks like in their own company, for example. And you can never, of course, you can do calibration, etc., but you can never calibrate people to an extent that they will always agree on complex situations and what's the correct answer, because there generally is no correct answer. And what is the correct solution depends on the situation, for example. And it also depends on the information available to the assessor. In my university, there's often a discussion like, how come that workplace assessors do not agree with the assessors in our university when you have placements, for example? And I think that's not very, I'm not really surprised that they do not agree, as they have different information about the student. The workplace supervisors work with the student on a daily basis, whereas the academic staff member go to the workplace for a visit, or a student writes a written report or does a presentation. And that's simply very different information the assessor has to base a judgment on. So I'm not very surprised that their judgments will differ. But somehow from these deeply rooted beliefs, we find it very unnerving when assessors do not agree. And the last one, the risk of over-specifying criteria, that when we try to calibrate assessors, we tend to do that by making a detailed list of assessment criteria. But that mitigates, that's a danger to the validity of assessment. As in these complex situations, you cannot have a list of criteria that fit every situation, that fit every that depicts the perfect solution, for example. Like in our university, we had this discussion about, in this rubric, it said that students had to use 5 references. And of course, that's easy to measure, but why on earth would 5 references represent the perfect solution and make a report a good report in a specific situation. You might have much more references in one situation than in the other. You might have more knowledge, etc. So what I mean is that our reliance on over-specifying criteria might endanger the validity. So that's not the way to go in this situation. So then in programmatic assessment, decision-making is based on aggregation of information. That's the picture we saw before with the vertical aggregation. And saturation, which actually means that when you add another data point, the decision will not change. So then you have reached saturation of information, like in qualitative research. And it's based on the idea of intersubjectivity. So we acknowledge that human judgment is inherently subjective, and we cannot, like by calibration, etc., we cannot standardize humans. So you need intersubjectivity. So you need many different judgments along the way. And when you take them all together, you will get a valid and reliable decision. That's why you need so many data points. So how do we do that? First of all, you collect many data points throughout the way. These data points are different, so they are not all the same assessment form. And you also collect different, what we call feedback perspectives. So a data point is in some way assessed, but it's not assessed in a sense that it's given a pass or fail decision. But yes, in my opinion, assessment is judgment. And judgment means that you say something about the quality of a student's work. How well did the student perform this task? How well did he do this knowledge test? So the different data points are always connected with those judgments. That's here in this picture, we call it the feedback form. In programmatic assessment, you usually have a feedback form connected to the learning outcomes. So the student gets feedback on their data point based on the learning outcomes. So all data points already are assessed during the way by multiple assessors, and those assessors could be academic staff, but could also be workplace supervisors, could be peers, could be clients, could be patients. So any stakeholder, any important stakeholder the student worked with can give his or her opinion on the quality of the student work. And that's how you collect the many subjective assessments, judgments that are at the end combined when you do make the high stakes decision. And that information could be quantitative or qualitative. So you could have some marks during the way, but you usually also have a lot of qualitative information that is the feedback that people give. And then the high stakes decisions are made by a committee. So you again have more people, so more intersubjectivity. And it's a holistic professional judgment based on all data points. The picture on the right-hand side, it depicts that the portfolio. So it's not just a portfolio with the work of the student, but it's a portfolio in which the work of the student has been assessed already, depicted by the question marks. So you have multiple judgments already. And the decision-making committee, usually by a stepwise procedure in which, for example, 2 assessors look at the portfolio first. And when they agree, the decision is being made. And when they don't agree, then the student is discussed in the entire committee. That's how you make decisions, and you look at the patterns. So I'm in those committees. So I do not assess all data points again. It has already been assessed by stakeholders that know much more about that specific assignment or situation than I do. So I rely on the assessments that already have been given during the way, but I look at the different patterns based on the learning outcomes. So I look whether a student in general has performed adequately on a certain learning outcome. And it doesn't matter when some of the data points failed or student performed less well in specific situations. But I do look at whether there are strange patterns, for example, for a certain learning outcome, always negative feedback. The student doesn't reflect on it, doesn't really improve. That's like a red flag when I go deeper into the portfolio. So that's how decisions are being made in programmatic assessment. And now, coming back to your question, could you help me what it was again?
So my question was about if there's such a high stakes decision at the end of the year, presumably you have to be transparent with the students about, here's all the different data points, and you have to, I don't know, whatever, reach 50% in 50% of them or something. If the student gets 0, 0, 0, at some point there becomes an assessment that is completely hurdle based or summative, unless you don't tell the students anything, at which point we risk not being transparent with our students about the importance of those data points. I guess, how do you deal with that?
Yes, that's a good one. And it's how we do that is that a very important principle is that a decision like this should not be a surprise to the student. And because you track progress along the way, students know that. So they have a portfolio in which they collect the data points, and very, very important, they have intermediate sessions with like a mentor or a supervisor who looks at the entire development on the learning outcomes. And that's where they discuss their progress. That's where they see the patterns themselves and see on which learning outcomes they have to improve, for example. And yes, I agree with you that the stakes gradually increase during that learning period, but the student also knows. And yes, the student will know that when he or she hasn't progressed on a certain learning outcome, that at the end, like, you have one opportunity to try to again show what you can, what you got, but then it's not a surprise in the sense that the student also knows that this is like a borderline situation. So most students will know, like my portfolio will go to this committee and I will pass, no surprise. The students who will fail, in general, they know. And sometimes they say, I don't even want to submit my portfolio to the committee because I already know this is no use. But the borderline cases also know. And they know that it will be kind of a surprise. So I agree with you, yes. That's how students know, and that's also how the stakes increase. So at the end, you do have less time, so less opportunities to improve before the final decision making will take place.
And sorry, there was one thing I'm sorry, I'm using all the time up to ask questions because I'm very interested in this. In one of your slides, you mentioned something about you're specifically focused on learning outcomes that are professional practice kind of outcomes, not in, areas where there is like a single correct answer, like maths. So I'm coming from the maths. But have you seen examples of programmatic assessment applied in areas where the vast majority of data points are exams or assessments with single answers, like that? It's basically the mark you get is the number of correct questions you answered.
I work with profession-oriented courses.
Okay,
so they indeed all have learning outcomes that are connected to future professional practice that in general involve placements or workplace learning or projects with real world supervisors, etc. I know in Maastricht we also have the progress test, which is really, it's only knowledge focused. And students have to, let me remember, I think 4 times a year they do this huge knowledge test, and they have to get an increasing percentage of answers correct during their course. So it's the same knowledge test.
It's the same knowledge, and is that like data points, and they can show? That's actually really interesting. I'd like to. Yeah, one day I might look that up. Actually, yeah.
Yeah, it's called the progress test.
Okay.
So that's how it might work. But in Maastricht, it's one of the data points, and they also have workplace learning, etc. Shall we move on to the last one? Of course, I'm always running out of time because I love those interesting questions. Here, high-stakes decision. This is the picture of the portfolios I wanted to show you. These are examples from real student portfolios in which you see on the upper right-hand side, you see the student score. It's in Dutch. My apologies, of course, it's Dutch portfolios. You see the score of the students increase during the year. On the left-hand side, it's the same. So the black horizontal line is it says the level that is expected in Dutch. So you see that the student is going up and down around the expected level, sometimes above, sometimes below. So those are the scores that the student got on the different data points. And the other one is the feedback. So in a portfolio, you can usually organize the feedback per learning outcome. So as a supervisor or as an assessor, I can access the portfolio and ask, for example, can you show me all the feedback this student got on learning outcome A? So I can organize this, and I can also say, like, can you show me the negative feedback? Can you show me the positive feedback? Can you show me the feedback given by workplace supervisors? Can you give me the feedback given by peers? So I can compare and look for those patterns in the portfolio. The last one, students as active agents in assessment, which is fundamentally different in programmatic assessment in a sense that the way we are used to assessment in higher education, and not in higher education, but everywhere, I think of assessment as involving hierarchical relationships between students and staff. It's the teacher who decides in the end. And students really have a say about a rubric, about decision making. Students find it difficult to really take up agency in assessment. And that's what we try in programmatic assessment, to make students really active agents in the entire assessment process. So this is really the assessment for learning part and how that works. So as I said before, in programmatic assessment, we try to design those data points longitudinally, so students can really take up feedback and use it in the next data point. And students are active participants in the assessment process because of this continuous dialogue about data points and feedback. It's the thing we just discussed regarding Monsi's question. Very important is that you have intermediate meetings with students to discuss the data points, also to discuss the feedback, as this third bullet point, making meaning of multiple, sometimes opposing viewpoints. Because you ask the different stakeholders to give feedback, they might not agree. And students will find that difficult to understand. How can different assessors or different feedback givers disagree about my performance here? So that's something you have to discuss with students to really interpret feedback. So they need, the feedback literacy discussion really comes in here. And I think all programs that I know have feedback literacy training for students. So students gradually learn how to ask for feedback on their data points, and also ask for specific feedback they need. When they are working on learning outcome A, they might ask more specific questions about that, for example, to really cultivate a feedback culture instead of a culture focusing on grading, on passing, etc. And also with regard to the development of evaluative judgment, in this system, we try to help students to increasingly be able to judge the quality of their own work. So in those feedback perspectives around a data point, the student can also be their own feedback givers, or they can evaluate the quality of their own work first and then ask others. And there usually is a lot of peer feedback involved as well. And students can develop this capability gradually because it's focused on the learning outcomes all the time. So they will also get more acquainted with the learning outcomes and what it really means and how it can be enacted in different situations. And some research we did on this with regard to teacher and student experiences. with programmatic assessment in different courses, different professional domains. So they think their experience in general are positive, but they do report that it's a real paradigm shift. They reported increased ownership and self-regulation. So that's also with regard to this flexibility. Can I choose my own data points? Can I choose my own points on which I need development? A changed mindset toward assessment. For example, valuing feedback instead of valuing the fact that you pass a certain assessment. For teachers, well, that's the unit level thing. They find it difficult to let go of separate modules, units, and assessments. And they find it difficult to trust holistic decision-making. In this decision-making process, at the end, you have to trust the judgments made by others. You have not assessed the work of the student yourself. There are data points that have been assessed by many different other people than yourself. And the students have to get used to the fact that they can make mistakes and that data points are something to learn from. So one of the quotes requires constant guidance to make clear that one bad data point is not a problem. So that's in one of the studies we did. That's in one of our courses. And the quotes are, I think, an illustration. I think this way of assessing, I like this way of assessing, as you get continuously asked for feedback. You build on that. It gives you a professional atmosphere. It's more than preparing for an assessment and just move on. And also, you hear it everywhere around you. You learn how to give feedback. You're constantly working on it. It's a kind of normal. So that's how they try to cultivate a feedback culture. And one of the funny things, I think, was that students also kind of trained or educated their workplace supervisors. And when they received feedback from their workplace supervisors, and it was like feedback like, oh, well done, they said things like, oh, but this is not the way good feedback should be given. And at the university, I learned that good feedback looks like this and this. Could you give me more specific feedback on? So I really liked it that they did a kind of boundary crossing exercises, moving this idea of assessment to the workplaces they were in. Yeah, that's the reflective activity, but maybe first questions about this learning part?
We do have one question in the Q&A, Liesbeth. How do academics manage giving feedback often and to many students when they are already incredibly time poor? So the question is around the scalability, and with all these conversations, how many students would an academic typically look after for this type of thing?
Most courses they organize like groups of students or learning teams, as they're sometimes called. And they might range from 12 students to 30 students, and they have a mentor or a supervisor who does these meetings, these intermediate meetings with the students. So he or she is the person who really works with students on their longitudinal development. And then the feedback givers depend a little bit on the data points. So like very knowledgeable academic staff or colleagues could give feedback on the data points that are most connected to their expertise. So maybe that's a kind of a fuzzy answer, but it's because the design is so fundamentally different. You can look at the data points, and some data points you will design beforehand. So all students have to do a certain data point, and then you can look at what expertise is needed to give feedback on these data points. And then you could assign time to the academic staff members to give feedback. It's really, when you implement programmatic assessment, you can also like start from scratch again and look at the time you give to the academic staff. And at least in the Netherlands, we have this distinction between teaching time and assessment time. But that really changes, because giving feedback, is that teaching or is it assessment time? So you could say like the assessment time is reduced, but the feedback time is increased. So that really needed some working with the management, for example, to really get them see like this is a different system in which you allocate the time differently.
Mm-hmm.
But we do this, I definitely have to say this is easier in courses with fewer students.
Fewer students. Yeah,
of course it is, but for example, everywhere. But for example, in Maastricht University, where I work in the bachelor program, and we're going to do the portfolio, this high stakes decision making in June, and we have 300 students per year. So we will have like 900 students to assess now at the end of the year to assess their portfolios. And well, it's quite a large. I think your student numbers are even much higher, aren't they?
I think that's
compared to a large. Yes,
where the
and
question's coming up.
Yes, and I can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But because the system changes completely, it's difficult to say like how many students will you have in your unit, because the units are organized so differently.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would advise is to do this feedback along the way. So that's when you do it efficiently. For example, a student could ask for feedback, or you could have a dialogue in a classroom or another educational setting in which a teacher can give partly group feedback. Students can document the feedback and send it to the teacher for validation, for example. So those ways of working are in generally easier and more rewarding somehow for the teachers. I think you should avoid to get the situation in which your entire group of students hands in a data point at a certain amount of time and you're sitting at home, like instead of grading, you're giving feedback to hundreds of students.
Yeah.
That would.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at the moment for Liesbeth? Liesbeth, can I ask one question in relation to the slide that showed the portfolio? Yeah, I noticed there is actually scoring at the side. Back to that point. So is that it's a score as there's a trajectory there? How is that score calculated? Is it a cumulative effect of various data points or whatever? So it's trying to understand what that score is depicting.
Yes. And the score comes from this feedback form or rubric that we use. So for each data point, the feedback giver gets a rubric, and it might have like 3 levels. So the rubric has also 3 levels, and that's what the score comes from. So it could be a score of 1, 2, or 3. Or some courses have a 5-point rubric, but that's how the score is calculated. And you see in this picture, here it says the meet moment, so it's the measuring moment. So these are different measurements. And in this case, the score, this is not the best example because this is a longitudinal. This is how the score increases. This is an example of this progress test, I think. Longitudinal rate. Let me look. I think this is this progress test in which students, this score is from 0 to 80%. So that's the percentage of questions that students answer correctly on this knowledge test.
Right.
And they have to show this increase in the percentage throughout the years. But in general, a portfolio would look more like this. Okay. So you have the desired level, and for example, you have a 5-point scale or a 3-point scale. So this would be like a score of this could be the score of 2 that is desired, and this could be the 1, and this could be the 3, this is the 2, this is the 1. So that's what the score comes from. We do have really discussions whether you want this score to appear in the portfolio, and it will tend to students again focus like we do. You focus on the score, and you focus on the increase on this graph. But I think you need it.
Great, thank you. Monsi.
I'm sorry, I've got lots of practical questions. How do you go about, so if we're talking about learning outcomes evidenced across an entire year, for example, how do you deal with incoming and outgoing student exchange? So where students take a semester abroad?
In a programmatic course, and when students do, we have minors, for example, when they do it elsewhere, they could use it as a data point.
Okay, for the students,
it's a piece of evidence.
Okay.
To demonstrate their learning.
Instead of the data points that okay. And what about incoming? Do you get many students coming into your program?
No, not really. That could be more difficult as when they expect something like a certificate or a grade or an assignment that they have passed or failed. Yeah. Of course, they could take along like the data point they worked on. Mm-hmm. But now I'm thinking aloud, like you could, of course, grade the data point. We do not do that, but you could, with a rubric like this, you could attach a pass-fail decision to a data point, like how well did you perform. But indeed, in the course itself, students would not get like a number of credit points.
Yep.
For a part of it.
Okay. All
right. We've got another question here, Liesbeth, from Alan. I'm impressed you've managed to get through the presentation without mentioning AI. I can see how this would mitigate some AI issues, but are you seeing any challenges?
Of course, we see challenges like I think you see in every course. For example, students could use GenAI to do their assignments. So a data point, the same as any assessment, could be developed using GenAI. I think what we try to do is, like with the learning outcomes, is work with students on GenAI and teach them how they can use GenAI responsibly. And because you get feedback on the data points so often, this mentor or supervisor person already notices. And of course, I can't say whether this works perfectly or always, but in general, because you have so many data points, and students in our courses are allowed to use GenAI as long as they report it and use it responsibly. We build it into the data points. And you will know how they use GenAI. And when they use it not responsibly, you will have noticed at an early stage. And that's in general, in research also demonstrates in programmatic assessment, not for GenAI, but in general, that you can detect struggling learners at an early stage. And I do not have research evidence on that yet, but I would expect the same for GenAI. So you would notice which students are using GenAI responsibly and students that are not using it in a responsible way. So I think it helps with GenAI because you work longitudinally. I think you need to have a clear look at your data points, that they're, for example, not only written products, but they also involve presentations, workplace situations. I'm talking about profession-oriented courses. So you have to have a look at the data points to make sure that not all data points can be easily created with GenAI. that because you're aggregating information across the different data points in this vertical way, I think you can, in that sense, mitigate the dangers of Gen AI, as not all data points should be designed in such a way that they can be easily created by Gen AI. But as in other fields of assessment, I think we're still experimenting. And now having our practical experiences with how this works in real higher education settings. Does that help a little? Not a real final definitive answer. I think this one was in the other chat, isn't it? In the Q&A. I didn't have a look at that one. But I think looking at the time, it's a good idea to move on to the reflective activity, because I would like to encourage you to think about what assessment might look like at this course level if you could design it from ground up, like in your large university-wide project. What could assessment look like? And this is the reflective activity that we came up with. So make a very simple drawing, as it might help you to use your brain in a different way. Make a very simple drawing of what assessment might look like. We will post a link to a Padlet pinboard in which you can post, using the plus sign, you can make a post on this pinboard. You can upload your drawing, or you can even allow your laptop to make a picture like I did in this picture. You can allow your laptop or your computer to make a picture of yourself holding up your drawing, which worked quite easily for me. And also write in your post a short explanation of your drawing. That will give Alice and Anne also some input from you to further use in this beautiful university-wide project, and to use later on, and to share some inspiration. You can also read each other's posts, you can comment on them, you can use smileys, etc. to react to posts of other people. And one tip is that you can zoom in and out using the control button and scroll with your mouse. So you can zoom in on a particular post or zoom out to see the entire pinboard. So let's just try whether this works.
Thank you so much. Please join me, everyone, in sincerely thanking Liesbeth for that amazing provocation. I think, as you can tell by the conversation that we've been having and the comments and reflections generated, it's certainly provided us with a lot to think about in terms of challenging our assumptions, particularly looking at assessment beyond the unit level and what potentially could be. And we're really grateful for your expertise and sharing the scholarly rigour as well, as you've been practicing and championing this work. So thank you so much for your time. We have put a link in the chat to a short survey. We do really encourage everyone to engage with the short questions there. That helps us capture current thinking that you might be having in response to the provocations, and we can then bring that together to help us shape the next steps forward with the assessment model. So we will follow up with the recordings, the link to the Padlet, and please do join me in thanking Liesbeth and continuing the conversation.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Liesbeth.
Thank you so much for the
you.
invitation.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your morning. Hopefully the family's awake now and have
Yes,
coffee.
they are awake and enjoy the rain in Australia, which is so welcome, I heard.
Yes, very
It's
welcome.
needed. Yes.
Very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.